Hello, welcome to another great episode of Royal Black and Elite. I'm Lady TrenettWilson, your lecturer and social historian, and today we're going to speak about a subject that is kind of tough to talk about. Back in the antebellum period and during slavery, there were black people who owned slaves. Now, most of the time in the cases, it was their family members that they owned. So they would manumit or buy their wife and their children oftentimes from out of slavery. And so that was the most in the majority of cases. But then there were cases, especially in New Orleans and Carolina, where there were black slave owners. And one such case was a man named William April Ellison Jr. Now, April, he was when he was born, he was named April because normally back in those days, the parent, if she was born, usually they were born into slavery, they would be named after the month that they were born in. So that's how his name was April. But in truth, his daddy was named William. And William was the son of the plantation that he was born on. And so William is actually the name, William is his name, and that's why he's a junior. Now, back then, if you were blessed enough, you could apprentice, and that's what he did. When he was 10 years old, he sent William away to be apprentice to learn how to make cotton gins. And cotton gins were very important back in those days because it would help you process the cotton. And so he was in high demand being able to learn a skill such as that. Now, he apprenticed with Mr. McWright. His name was William also for about 10 years or so. So he was a grown man. He was 21 when he finally stopped apprenticing and he was able to open up his own shop. And at that time, he also married a young woman in 1816, and her name was Matilda. Matilda was a slave girl and she was only 16 at the time. Now, William and Matilda had six children. And let me back up. Remember, we know that back in those days, they married girls very young. So now Matilda and him had six children. And oddly enough, when he opened up his shop, and this was about again 1816, 1817, when he opened up his cotton gin shop, he actually hired slaves to work in the shop. So he early on believed that it was okay to hire slaves, and he believed in slavery, which is really, I guess, when I look back on this and I study the social aspects and, the aspects of slavery, it just always astounds me that people could enslave others when they themselves had been enslaved. However, he didn't see the side the field Negroes saw. And if you want to know more about that, definitely click down below. I do have a video there that talks about the Blue Vein Society and how the field Negro and the house Negro was separated. So he was definitely not even a house Negro. He was out apprenticing while most kids, who were not the son of the master's son, was able to, well, not able to, but they were out there picking cotton. So it was unfair on many levels, but that's what he did. Now, by the time um, 1824 or so came along. So he had been in business for about 7 years. He was already wealthy. And the reason we know that is because he bought a pew at his church, and that was a big deal. And he went to a predominantly white church, by the way. And, that's really curious also to me because his wife was a slave and he had to buy her out of slavery. So just I, the level of cognizant dissident that these people had to walk in, it must have been astounding. But this is this man's life. He believed in slavery and he himself had slave, and he was just getting started. By 1830, he had four slaves, and again, they were working in the cotton gin store that he had established. Now, a lot of times they wanted to just play slaves versus hiring people because it was much cheaper. This foolishness is still happening today with children working and overseas and internationally building shoes and toys, so it's really sad. Now, by 1840, he had 10 slaves. And by 1850, he opened up a blacksmith shop, and his business was in high demand. So he was buying more slaves. Now, he also bought land. And so by 1850, he bought a piece of property, and it was 386 acres. And that's when he formally started his own plantation. It's just sad to hear. 32 slaves he had when he first started out. Now, I can only surmise that because his father was white, maybe he didn't have a proximity to blackness and he didn't have a problem with enslaving, other people. So I'm not giving him an excuse. I'm just trying to look at some type of reason as to why this man would do this. Now, the Ellison family, he had two sons, and they had grown, and by the time he passed, they owned 171 slaves. He also bought two more plantations. So he bought one in 1852, and it was called Keith Hill, and then he bought another one the same year, and it was called Hickory Hill, and it brought his land standing up to 1,000 acres. So he split the land between he and his sons. And his sons also held slaves as domestic workers. Now, when the American Civil War broke out, in 1861, Ellison offered labor from 53 of his slaves to the Confederacy. Can you believe it? They fought for the Confederate Army. Black people who were slaves fought in the Confederate Army at the behest of a black man or a mixed race man. He not only did that, he also converted his plantation into mixed crops. So now not only is he growing cotton, but he's also growing food in order to feed the Confederate soldiers. This story is just whoa. His family, who were very wealthy at the time, they donated money and they brought Confederate bonds. Also, his sons tried to enlist in the Confederate Army, but they could not because they were black. So here they are donating money, building crops for these people, letting them sleep at their house, and using 53 of his slaves, and his sons couldn't fight for that army. And I am just, again, this story just blew my mind because I was like, wow, how could you do this? And so in the end, we know what happened. And I'm so grateful as an African American woman that the Union won, the North won. So what happened to the Ellison family as a result of that? Well, as a result, they went broke. Now, Mr. Ellison died on December the 5th, 1861. So he didn't get to see the end of the war, but the bonds that they had bought were worthless and they lost everything. The boys lost everything. So it was not a pretty end for their family. Now, they did keep their property, some of it, and so they were buried on their property, but the wealth was gone. So that is the story of Mr. William Ellison Jr. At his death, he provided by giving, they had a will. So he had at his death 60 slaves. At his height, 171. So he divvied out the slaves to the children, and he had one daughter who was also a slave, and he gave her $500. So what we see here is not only were white men abusing the black women and having children, but also mixed race slave owners were as well. Well, I want to thank you for joining me. I really appreciate you. As always, I hope that you enjoyed it. And my lecture is for, say it with me, educational and entertainment purposes only. If you want to continue to learn more, definitely click down below. And remember, I think that's what it's called. The Fair Use Act is in my description. So thank you for joining me, and I'll see you on another great episode of Royal Black and Elite.